On the 1st of April 1945, a combined American and British Empire fleet appeared off Okinawa, the southernmost of the Japanese home islands. Operation Iceberg, the final naval battle of the Second World War, was about to begin, as hundreds of aircraft roared overhead and enormous shells fired from battleships pounding the shore. Landing craft steamed ashore carrying tens of thousands of troops into battle. The battle for Okinawa is remembered as among the most savage of the Pacific Campaign, marked by extreme resistance by Japanese soldiers and civilians alike. Equally savage was the aerial battle, which raged over the invasion fleet as pilots of the Japanese special attack units, better known as the Kamikaze, brought their bomb-laden aircraft screaming down into the Allied ships. While by this time Allied sailors had weathered kamikaze attacks for nearly 6 months, the Battle of Okinawa brought with it a terrifying new threat. Just after 7 p.m. on April the 1st, the crew of the Colorado-class battleship USS West Virginia, a veteran of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, saw a tiny white aircraft screaming towards them at terrifying speed, a fountain of flames streaming from its tail. Though West Virginia's gunners quickly filled the sky with a wall of tracers, the aircraft rocketed through the defensive screen and slammed into the battleship just forward of her No. 2 gun director, setting off a massive explosion that killed 4 sailors and wounded 7. West Virginia had been struck by a Yokosuka MXY-7 Ohka. Effectively a manned rocket-propelled bomb designed for a single one-way mission, the Ohka was one of the most ghoulish weapons of war ever devised and a perfect distillation of the sheer desperation which fueled late-war Japan. But while the kamikazes have become infamous, less well known is that halfway across the world, the Allied fleet, which invaded Normandy in June 1944, nearly suffered a similar fate at the hands of Imperial Japan's Axis ally Nazi Germany. In the desperate dying days of the Third Reich, the Nazis attempted to assemble their own Kamikaze Squadron, whose pilots, like modern-day Viking berserkers, were to ram their jet-powered flying bombs into enemy ships and bombers, inflicting, it was hoped, such horrific casualties that the Allies would be forced to sue for peace. Thankfully, however, a lack of resources and ideological differences among the German High Command prevented this insane plan from being carried out. This is the story of Leonidas Squadron, the forgotten Nazi kamikazes. By early 1944, it was becoming clear that for Nazi Germany, the war was effectively lost. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, had been blunted and reversed at Stalingrad, with the Soviet Red Army pushing the German armies in the east into an irreversible retreat. Meanwhile, British and American strategic bombers were pounding German cities round the clock, killing thousands and inflicting severe shortages of weapons and material of all kinds. In Italy, Allied troops were pushing ever northward, and all signs pointed to an imminent amphibious landing in northern France. The only question was, when and where? Still, the increasingly delusional and extremely drugged-up brained Adolf Hitler refused to accept reality and ordered his commanders to fight on. Unfortunately, Der Führer's warped strategic vision undermined the Reich's war effort at every turn. Refusing to accept that Germany was now on the defensive, Hitler insisted that his forces remain on the offensive. As a result, development pushed forward on the so-called Vergeltungswaffe, or vengeance weapons, like the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 ballistic missile, which Hitler hoped to strike back at the British Isles with. And instead of the fighters and interceptors desperately needed to stave off the Allied bombing campaigns, German aircraft factories, already stretched to their limits, continued to produce bombers and ground attack aircraft. Even the Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe, the world's first operational jet fighter, was initially pressed into service as a bomber, a role to which it was ill-suited. It was not until Germany's situation became truly desperate that Hitler and other high officials authorized the deployment of cheap and easily manufactured emergency fighters in a vain bid to stem the tide of Allied bombers. These included some truly outlandish designs that were often more dangerous to their pilots than the enemy, including the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet and Bachem BA-349 Natter and the Heikel HE-162 Volksjäger or People's Fighter, a plywood jet designed to be flown by hastily trained members of the Hitler Youth. Because, surely nothing could go wrong with putting virtually untrained children into plywood planes with a jet engine bolted on. Nothing at all wrong there. However, repelling the anticipated Allied naval landing in France would require a different type of weapon, one that could penetrate a dense screen of anti-aircraft fire and deliver a large enough explosive warhead to sink a major warship. While the Luftwaffe had developed advanced radio-guided munitions like the Fritz X and Henschel HS-293, the ancestors of modern smart bombs, these had to be launched close to their targets by slower bomber motherships, which were highly vulnerable to enemy attack. And while the Kriegsmarine or Navy had assembled a flotilla of explosive motorboats called Linsen and sneaky tiny submarines like the Neger, Molch, Hecht, Biber, and Seehund, in actual combat these proved embarrassingly ineffective. Instead, key figures in the armed forces, including Luftwaffe bomber pilot Heyer Hermann, commando leader SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, and famous test pilot Hannah Reach, suggested developing a manned version of the Feisler Fi-103 flying bomb, better known as the V-1. An early form of cruise missile, the V-1 was powered by an Argus AS-109 pulse jet engine, an extremely simple and cheap jet engine that used a set of spring-loaded shutters to generate a rapid series of combustion pulses, hence the name. Launched from a steam-powered catapult, the missile was held at a specified heading and altitude by a simple autopilot until a small propeller-driven odometer in the nose indicated it was over its target. A special mechanism then pulled it into a steep dive, sending it and its 850-kilogram high-explosive warhead plunging into the target below. Between June 1944 and March 1945, the Germans launched over 8,000 V-1s against targets in Britain and Allied-occupied Belgium, killing or wounding nearly 23,000 people. Despite enthusiastic support from such prominent figures, the manned V-1 proposal was initially passed over in favor of a rival program, the Messerschmitt Me-328. Originally conceived in 1941 as a parasite aircraft carried by Luftwaffe bombers in order to defend them against Allied aircraft, later in the war, the Me-328 was reimagined as a cheap, easily manufactured emergency fighter for use against Allied bomber formations. And to learn more about the surprisingly long and fascinating history of parasite aircraft, please do check out our previous video, The Real-Life Marvel-esque Flying Aircraft Carriers. Now, at Hitler's insistence, ground attack versions were also proposed, because, of course they were. Measuring only 7 meters long and 7 meters wide and built mainly out of wood, the diminutive aircraft was to be powered by a 2.4 Argus AS-014 pulse jet engine, similar to those used by the V-1, giving it a top speed of 805 kilometers an hour. Originally, the aircraft was meant to be armed with a pair of MG-151 20mm automatic cannons, but this was later changed to a single 500-kilogram high-explosive warhead in the nose. In combat, the M328 would either be air-launched from a carrier aircraft or ground-launched from a steam catapult, whereupon the pilot would guide the aircraft into the middle of an Allied bomber formation, set the fuse on the warhead, and bail out, at which point the warhead would detonate and hopefully take out multiple bombers at once. That was the plan anyway. In reality, the pilot's chance of surviving such an attack were diminutive, effectively making the Me-328 a Selbststoffe, or to say it in a way that won't get this video age-restricted, an aircraft in which the pilots would not have any additional missions afterwards. But this disturbing proposition was the least of Messerschmitt's problems, for early flight tests, many carried out by Hannah Reich herself, revealed a troubling flaw with the design. The twin pulse jet engines produced excessive resonance, thrust asymmetry, and vibration, which not only made it unpleasant to fly, but also threatened to shake the fragile airframe apart. This led to at least one prototype and its pilot being lost during flight testing. No matter what Messerschmitt engineers tried, the problem could not be resolved, and in mid-1944 the project was cancelled in favor of the manned V-1, dubbed the Feisler Fi-103R Reichenberg. Development of the Reichenberg began in the summer of 1944 at the German Research Institute for Sailplane Flight, or DFS, in Einring, Bavaria. The missile was fitted with a small single-seat cockpit and canopy just forward of the pulse jet intake, an area which normally held compressed air cylinders for operating the missile's controls. These were replaced by a single cylinder fitted further aft, in the space normally occupied by the missile's now redundant autopilot. The cockpit was very Spartan, with a plywood bucket seat, simple controls, and rudimentary flight instruments, while the canopy was fitted with an armored windscreen. The wooden wings were also fitted with reinforced metal edges to cut the cable of barrage balloons. No landing gear was provided, for, like the Me-328, the Reichenberg was meant to be air-launched from beneath the wings of a mothership bomber such as the Heinkel HE-111, which had already been used to launch unmanned V-1 missiles. Once launched, the pilot would fly under power towards the target area before entering a steep dive and bailing out at the last minute, allowing the missile and its 850-kilogram high-explosive warhead to impact the ship, bridge, or other target it was aimed at. Unsurprisingly, as with the Me-328, the pilot's chances of surviving such a maneuver were realistically slim to none, especially as the intake for the pulse jet engine was located right above the pilot's head. What could go wrong? Indeed, while the Nazis praised extreme bravery in battle and became increasingly fanatical as the war dragged on, deliberate, unintentional, abrupt retiring pilots from life attacks were not part of Germanic warrior tradition, and the Selbstwaffe concept was viewed with great skepticism by senior Nazi leaders, including Hitler and Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler, who called for the project to be abandoned. However, Otto Skorzeny lobbied hard for the program's reappraisal, and eventually Hitler approved the formation of a special unit known as Leonidas Squadron, named, of course, after the legendary Spartan king who held off the Persians at the 480 BCE Battle of Thermopylae. Leonidas Squadron was the fifth Staffel of Kampfgeschwader, or KG-200, a highly specialized Luftwaffe unit formed in February 1944 to carry out secret missions like infiltrating secret agents behind enemy lines. Allegedly, the minuscule but non-zero chance of Reichenberg pilots being able to safely bail out allowed Skorzeny to convince Himmler and Hitler that Leonidas Squadron was not, in fact, an unaliving squadron. However, its pilots, or volunteers, were required to recite the following oath, but, in no doubt super angry-sounding German, and substituting the ceasing to continue to exist word for something else because certain words are taboo on YouTube. I hereby voluntarily apply to be enrolled in the voluntarily ceasing to exist group as part of a human glider bomb. I fully understand that employment in this capacity will entail my own death. Flight testing of the first prototype Reichenbergs began in September 1944 at the Luftwaffe's main proving grounds at Rechlin in Pomerania. Unfortunately, the first test flight ended in a fatal crash, thought to have been caused by the pilot accidentally jettisoning the canopy. The second flight the following day also ended in a crash, prompting experienced test pilots Hanno Reich and Hans Kenscher to be called in. Even for such experienced pilots, the Reichenberg proved treacherous, with Reich surviving several violent crashes. On November 5, 1944, engine vibration caused one of the prototypes to shed a wing and spiral to the earth. Thankfully, Kenscher was able to bail out, but only with great difficulty due to the aircraft's cramped cockpit. These dangerous flight tests revealed that Reichenberg had an unusually high stall speed, and that previous test pilots had attempted to land too slowly and had crashed as a result. They also spawned a popular myth about the development of the V-1 flying bomb, one perpetuated by, among other sources, the 1965 British spy thriller Operation Crossbow. In the film, Hanno Reich is shown piloting a manned V-1 far earlier in the war in order to correct stability issues with the unmanned missile. In reality, such test flights never happened, or the Reichenbergs flown by Reich in 1944 were all launched from Heikel HE-111 bombers, not from a steam catapult as depicted in the film. Meanwhile, the men of Leonidas Squadron underwent extensive training to prepare them for their deadly missions. This began with training flights in gliders, whose wings were shortened to simulate the handling of the Reichenberg. Trainees then moved to the FI-103R2, an unpowered training variant with a second cockpit and dual controls for an instructor and a ventral skid for landing. This was followed by flights in the R3 pulse-jet-powered two-seater and finally the R1 unpowered single-seat trainer. While the flying bomb's high stall speed made it difficult to land, by the fall of 1944, some 70 pilots were successfully trained. Meanwhile, the production line was established at Dannenberg in Lower Saxony, which ultimately turned out a total of 175 Reichenbergs. However, Leonidas Squadron continued to face opposition from key figures, including Minister of Armaments and War Production Albert Speer and Oberst Werner Barbach, commander of KG-200, who argued that deploying the unit against the Allied invasion fleet at Normandy was a waste of brave men and precious resources. Several alternative deployments were considered, such as using Reichenbergs against Soviet power stations on the Eastern Front or ramming them into Allied bomber formations, but ultimately Hitler ordered the project suspended in October 1944 before any missions could be flown. It was finally cancelled on March 15, 1945, barely a month and a half before the end of the war in Europe. Instead, KG-200 adopted the only slightly less retirement from breathing Mistel or mistletoe composite aircraft developed by Werner Barbach. This consisted of a bomber such as a Junkers Ju-88 stripped of its seats, flight controls, guns, and other equipment, and fitted with a giant 2-ton shaped charged warhead. A single-seat fighter, such as a Messerschmitt Bf-109 or Focke-Wulf FW-190, was fixed to the top of the explosive-laden drone using special brackets, and the controls of the two aircraft linked, allowing the pilot of the fighter to guide the combination to the target area. It would then align the composite aircraft with the target, activate the drone's autopilot, and detach the fighter from its mounting brackets using explosive bolts, allowing the drone to fly on alone to its fiery destiny. While Mistels were deployed on several occasions against Allied ships and harbor facilities in Normandy and Soviet power stations, armament factories, and bridges on the Eastern Front, as covered in our previous video, Mistel, Nazi Germany's bizarre piggyback attack aircraft, these operations were largely unsuccessful, the slow, unwieldy combinations proving horribly inaccurate and extremely vulnerable to Allied fighter aircraft. But the cancellation of the Reichenberg Man V1 program was not the end of the Leonidas Squadron or of Nazi aerials ceasing to exist attacks. As the Allied bombing offensive against Germany continued to intensify, the Luftwaffe High Command realized it would have to achieve kill ratios on the order of 3-1 in order to have any hope of turning the tide. Unfortunately, the standard weapons carried by German fighter aircraft, typically a combination of 8mm machine guns and 20mm cannons, were simply not up to the task, while heavier weapons like the Mk-108 30mm cannon and the 21cm Werfer granite rocket, capable of taking down a bomber with one shot, were developed and deployed. These were either too inaccurate or available in insufficient numbers to make any real difference. So, in desperation, the Luftwaffe turned to an extreme tactic which had been used to great effect by Soviet pilots on the Eastern Front: ramming. In early 1945, a new unit was formed, initially dubbed Werewolf but later renamed Sonderkommando Elbe to avoid confusion with the stay-behind guerrilla unit of the same name. Sonderkommando Elbe comprised 183 Messerschmitt Bf-109G fighters, stripped of nearly all armor and armaments, save for a single MG-131 machine gun in the nose, supplied with a mere 30 rounds. Their pilots, based at Stendal Airfield west of Berlin, were trained to ram their aircraft into vulnerable areas of Allied bombers, such as the tail, engines, and cockpit, in order to inflict maximum damage. As with Leonidas Squadron, these pilots technically had a tiny chance of surviving such rammings and successfully bailing out, helping to maintain the fragile delusion that the unit was anything other than an afterlife accelerator squad. Sonderkommando Elbe saw action only once on April 7, 1945, flying against Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses and consolidated B-24 Liberators of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Divisions of the American 8th Air Force on their way to Berlin. The results were dismal, with all 183 attacking aircraft and all but 27 of their pilots being destroyed. In return, of the 1,304 bombers and 792 fighters that attacked Berlin that day, only 29 were brought down, no more than were typically lost on an average mission. Strangely, the Reich propaganda ministry of Dr. Joseph Goebbels failed to make any mention of Sonderkommando Elbe's heroic sacrifice, and as a result, Allied pilots mistook the ramming attacks for accidental collisions caused by inexperienced pilots. Less than 2 weeks later, it was finally Leonidas Squadron's turn to fly into battle. Re-equipped with Focke-Wulf 190 fighter bombers loaded with as many bombs as they could carry, between April the 17th and 20th, 1945, the unit, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Heiner Lange, carried out a series of Selbstopfereinsatz, or self-sacrifice attacks, against bridges on the Oder River in a desperate bid to slow the Soviet advance towards Berlin. 35 pilots were lost in the process, and while the Luftwaffe claimed 17 bridges were taken out, later researchers revealed that only the railway bridge at Kustrin was definitively destroyed. In the end, however, the Nazis were reluctant to pursue full-on pilot body exploding attacks, and the few operations that were carried out had next to no impact on the outcome of the war. This all was, however, a fixture of the Japanese warrior tradition, and the armed forces of Imperial Japan pursued this doctrine to a far greater extent than their German allies. Though these aerial units, officially designated Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogakitai, or Special Attack Units, but better known as the Kamikaze or Divine Wind, such attacks were carried out using a variety of vehicles and other methods, including motorboats, tiny submarines, and even divers. Initially, the aerial kamikaze units made use of whatever existing aircraft were available, from fighters and torpedoes to dive bombers to rickety old training biplanes. In the final year of the war, however, Japanese engineers set about developing a variety of more advanced and specialized aircraft specifically designed for the kamikaze role. Among the first was the Kawanishi Baika, or Plum Blossom, a single-seat pulse-jet-powered aircraft inspired by the German Messerschmitt Me-328 and the Fieseler Fi-103R Reichenberg. Throughout the war, Germany and Japan enjoyed a limited but useful trading relationship, with Japan supplying Germany with much-needed raw materials like rubber and tin in exchange for advanced German military technology. As the war dragged on and the Allies gained air and sea superiority over more and more of the globe, an increasing amount of this trade was carried out by submarine. The technology supplied to Japan by Germany included jet engines like the Junkers Jumo 004 used on the Messerschmitt Me-262 fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet rocket interceptor, and the V-1 flying bomb and its Argus AS-014 pulse jet engine. But while the Japanese soon created their own versions of the Me-262 and Me-163, the Nakajima Kika and the Mitsubishi J-8M Shusui, respectively, material shortages and an ever-worsening strategic situation severely delayed their development, prompting a search for simpler, more readily produced alternatives. The Biker was such an aircraft. Measuring 7 meters long, with a wingspan of 6.5 meters, the single-seat Biker was powered by a Maru 3500 kilonewton thrust Ka-10 pulse jet engine, a close copy of the German Argus AS-014, mounted above and behind the cockpit, which gave it a theoretical maximum top speed of 650 km per hour and a range of 280 km. 3 different versions of the aircraft were designed: the Type 1, which had jettisonable landing gear and rocket boosters for conventional ground takeoff, the Type 2, designed to be launched from aircraft carrier submarines like the I-400 class, and the Type 3, which had no landing gear and was designed to be air-launched from a bomber mothership like the Mitsubishi G4M Betty. In all cases, the pilot would carry out a powered dive all the way to the target, delivering the aircraft's only weapon, a 250-kilogram high-explosive warhead. However, the Biker was still on the drawing board when the war ended, and none were ever built or flown. However, the Japanese did manage to deploy an even simpler, unaliving aircraft, the Yokosuka MXY-7 Ohka, or Cherry Blossom. The concept for this aircraft was dreamed up in mid-1944 by Naval Ensign Otter, a pilot of the 405th Kokutai Air Transport Unit. Having limited engineering experience, Otter submitted his idea to the Aeronautical Research Institute at the University of Tokyo, who then passed it on to the Imperial Japanese Navy's Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal near Yokohama for further development. The finalized aircraft measured 6 meters long with a wingspan of 5 meters and weighed 2,000 kilos, more than half of which was accounted for by the 1,200 kilogram Amanal explosive warhead mounted in its nose. Several different versions of this ghoulish manned missile were designed, for example the Model 22, which was powered by an Ishikawajima TSU-11 thermojet, a primitive type of jet engine in which fuel is injected and burned in a turbine driven by a conventional piston engine in order to give it a greater range. The Model 33, 43A, 43B, and 53 were all powered by N20 turbojet engines, a copy of the German BMW 003, with these various versions being specially modified for air-launched submarine launch, catapult launch from caves, and aero tow launch, respectively. An interceptor version, known as the Suzuka 24, was also developed, powered by an NE-20 engine and armed with a pair of 20mm automatic cannons. These were allegedly deployed once on April 3, 1945, against a flight of American B-29 Superfortress bombers, but this claim has been disputed by historians. The only version of the Ohka to definitively see combat was the Model 11, powered by 3 Type 4 solid-fuel rocket boosters mounted behind the cockpit. The Model 11 was designed to be carried within around 30 kilometers of its target by a Mitsubishi G4M mothership, whereupon it and its pilot, sealed inside the cockpit before takeoff, would be released. The pilot would glide most of the way to the combat zone before aiming his craft at an enemy ship and igniting the rockets. These would generate 7,850 kilonewtons of thrust for around 4 minutes, accelerating the Ohka to a blistering 960 kilometers an hour and making the tiny craft extremely difficult to shoot down as it careened toward its target. Such was the desperate need for weapons that full-scale production of the Ohka began in late 1944, before flight testing had even finished. Various components were manufactured by private firms, including Dan Ichikaigen, Fuji, and Hitachi. Yes, that Fuji and Hitachi, while final assembly took place at the Yokosuka and Kasumagara naval arsenals. By March 1945, 852 Ohkas had been completed, of which 755 were Model 11s. The rest were largely training gliders such as the Model 11 K1 and the Model 43 K1. The former was a single-seater which carried water ballast in place of the warhead and rocket motors, while the latter featured twin cockpits for a student and instructor and a single Type 4 rocket motor for limited powered flight. Both were fitted with flaps and a ventral skid to allow them to land. A single experimental Model 21 was also produced, featuring steel wings made by the Nakajima Aircraft Company. The first Ohkas and their pilots, members of the awesomely named Jinrai Butai, or Thunder God Corps, were deployed to the Philippines in October 1944 to participate in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest single naval battle of the Second World War. However, the aircraft carriers transporting the Ohkas and their motherships, the Shinao and the Oya, were sunk by the U.S. Navy submarines USS Archerfish and USS Redfish before they could reach Leyte. It would not be until April 1, 1945 that the Ohkas would be deployed again during the Battle of Okinawa. As mentioned at the start of the video, the first Allied ship to record being hit by an Ohka was the battleship USS West Virginia, though given the relatively minor damage inflicted, it is likely that the aircraft only scored a near miss. The attack also demonstrated a fundamental flaw in the Ohka concept: the extreme vulnerability of the slow, unmaneuverable mothership. Of the 6 G4M Bettys that attacked on April 1st, none made it back to base. But the attacks kept coming, and on April 12th, the Ohka scored its first combat victory off Okinawa, sinking the Sumner-class destroyer USS Manat El Abili and killing 84 of her crew. During the same action, the Gleaves-class destroyer USS Jeffers destroyed an attacking Ohka with anti-aircraft fire, but the aircraft's warhead detonated close to the ship, causing extensive damage. The Fletcher-class destroyer USS Stanley was also attacked by 2 Ohkas, with one punching right through the ship's hull and detonating in the water on the other side, and the other barely missing, knocking down the Stanley's ensign, or its flag, from its mast. By this time, American sailors had taken to calling the Fiendish Man missiles Baka bombers, after the Japanese word for fool or crazy. More Ohka attacks followed on April 14th, 16th, and 28th, but none achieved any hits, and only 3 of the 17 motherships deployed returned to base. It was not until May 4th that Robert H. Smith-class destroyer USS Cher and the Admirable-class minesweeper USS Gaiety were successfully struck by Ohkas, suffering severe damage. 1 week later, on May 11th, the Sumner-class destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley was struck and damaged so badly that she was deemed irreparable and later decommissioned and sold for scrap. In response to the Baka bomb threat, the US Navy expanded its aerial patrols in order to shoot down the motherships before they could get within launching distance of the fleet. Thanks to these measures and upgraded anti-aircraft defenses aboard Navy warships, the number of successful attacks dropped off sharply. In the end, the Ohkas, like the Kamikaze campaign as a whole, proved a costly failure. Of the 300 Ohkas deployed to Okinawa, only 74 were actually launched against the enemy. Of these, only 18 carried out successful attacks, the rest being destroyed by American fighter aircraft or anti-aircraft guns. And for all this senseless sacrifice, only 1 ship was sunk and 5 were damaged. And so ended the brief and terrifying reign of the purpose-built, unaliving aircraft. Perhaps more than any other weapon, the Yokosuka Ohka, Feisler, Reichenberg, and their brethren encapsulate in wood, metal, and explosives and flesh the heights of fanaticism, desperation, and sheer madness which drove the most destructive conflict in modern history.